Welcome, everybody. Delighted that you're here. Is Miss Susan with us today, Jeannie?
She is.
Oh, great. Well, Miss Susan, I just wanted to thank you for your input yesterday regarding churchianity. I awakened with, it's not a question I had really considered before. And for me, it points up one of the reasons why I'm so appreciative of this interaction we get to have, because you aroused questions for me that I hadn't asked myself, and this morning had just totally clear guidance that resolves, I think, that whole issue, and that is my waking time in the morning is usually when I get my best guidance, and as I was awakening this morning, it was like recognizing that what I've been calling churchianity would be the dark side of what people would call Christianity, but in reality, it's really only the dark side of the people engaged in whatever it is, whether, there's a dark side to, or we say there's a dark side to, each and every religion, and there is no dark side to any religion. They're just people who haven't dealt with their own shadow. And so from now on, whenever I refer to that, I'll refer to the shadow side of religion or Christianity or whatever it is we're talking about, rather than, and then refer back to the people involved who are still working out of the shadow. And then one gentleman who was really into psychology in Florida, this goes back years ago, and was really into Carl Jung and such, and when he started to do work, he was like, this work is shadow work on steroids. And so thank you for that feedback. It was really a nice gift. Much appreciated.
Thank you for being so nice about it. I appreciate that a lot. Thanks. Good thought.
Well, I appreciated it too. Yeah, it was just so crystal clear this morning. It's like, Michael, you need to resolve this. You need to do some work around this. And yes, there is a shadow side. And ultimately, we all need to, to me, again, the Greek, one of the distinctions I want to keep making with this work we're doing with the Enlightenment book is that the Aramaic is always pointing toward the actuality, and the Greek is mostly pointing toward the reality, toward the mind's perception, which would be the shadow side. So, nice refinement for me. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being so gracious about it. Right.
Any more morsels for us?
No, I don't think so. I've been thinking about a podcast that Dr. Tim had us listen to with a man named Gruder and Laurie Morse. I'm not sure Gruder's first name, maybe it's John, I forget. Anyway, he combines a lot of things that I've been thinking about. One thing he warns against is, you call it premature enlightenment or something like that. What's your word for it? When you get there before you're there.
Premature, say again? When
you think you're there. Like, I have a friend who often says, when I'm telling her about something that's been on my mind, something that I've need to do work on, she says, well, after all, we're all one. And I think, yeah, I heard that, but I'm not there right now. And if you go there, it's of absolutely no help to me at all. So,
well, I think you may be referring to the thought in the book of premature positive thinking. Pretending something's true that isn't true.
Say that last time.
It may be something. Pretending that something true is true that isn't true for you. It may be the truth, but it's not true for me yet. Everybody's one. Well, somebody tells me that, and I go, well, that makes sense. So and that's true. I mean, Einstein even documents that. But if I'm still thinking that the problem is that guy over there, that's not true for me. So that would be premature positive thinking, or I think another way to speak about it or think about it is it's a spiritual bypass. No, I'll just take
there
this.
He goes. Yeah, that's the word.
Get out of the spiritual
Misguided.
bypass game and do our work.
Right. Absolutely. Well, everything he says, he talks about, he kind of translated for me a word that I've never been able to apply very well because it's just a different language, a different word. Talks about raising your vibration. And I thought, well, that sounds good. How do you do that and what does that mean? And he's hitching it up with just getting conscious, becoming aware of that you're projecting, you have work to do. There are lots of ways to raise your vibration without calling it that. That's been very helpful. I'm not being very coherent, I'm afraid, on this, but it all ends up to tell everybody that if you have an issue, you've got to do your work on it, which is, you've been singing that song ever since I started the radio show. If in AA they say, if you spot it, you've got it. And sometimes that feels pretty harsh, but if you spot it and have a reaction, it is your garbage and needs work.
There's the key, the reaction.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if you spot it, you got it. We wouldn't be able to see an anomaly or some form of insanity if we hadn't been there, done that. If we didn't have the brain cells for it, our mind could not create a construct around it. And if our mind creates a construct, we've been there, and there are two places we can have been there from, and one of them is been there, done the work on it, so I can spot it. I can hold a space of love for its healing and hold it accountable out of love. The other is I haven't done my work, and so I go nuts around it. And that's where the invitation is always for each of us to do our work. If I love the tests that the Course in Miracles offers. If you remember, one of them is, the easy one is, if you think of someone, are you at perfect peace? First test, the easy one. And then the tough one is, if they think of you, do they share your perfect peace? And
that is tough. Yeah.
If not, then then we've got a piece of the rope of the energy in there, and we can continue to clean that up until we can really return to that truly connected place consciously.
He also said things like, it's great to use affirmations. They could be like training wheels. They give you a picture of where you want to be, but if that's what you give yourself and haven't done the work, then the affirmations aren't going to do much for you. This man is just synthesizing a lot of the things that you and Dr. Tim have been teaching. It's
cool. You'll have to send me a link. My take is never use an affirmation. If you have to use an affirmation, again, that's more of the premature positive thinking. Turn your affirmation into a mind shifter. We've got a tool for that. Use it as a mind shifter and uncover the part of your mind in need of healing and do your healing work.
I could say
so I'm all
have
for.
The link. I have the link to that in the. Yeah, it's Gruder. His first name's David, and Laurie Morris, and it's totpodcast.net. I've got a link to it in the notes for today.
And it's episode 46 is the one Dr. Tim was recommending we listen to. It's very good. But you, Michael, you don't need to. You know it all, but it's a different way of presenting material. It was fun to listen to. Answered a few questions.
Yeah. Well, I'm really clear that I don't know it all.
Well, Dr. Tim is going to be having him on the radio show sometime late in February. Yeah. Just very exciting, which means we can talk to him. We can press 1 and have some action there, too.
Interact directly.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Very cool. All right, young lady, any other thoughts for you?
Not at the moment. I'm just going to settle in and listen.
You have a blessed one.
You too.
Miss Jeannie, do we have anybody else in the phone queue with a hand up or anything happening in the chat room?
No, it's all quiet on this end.
Well, then let's...
Podbean's also quiet, so.
Okay. Well, let's head to page 19 of the Enlightenment book, and let's see. As I look at page 19, it looks like by the time we get to the end of the first century definitions of the Aramaic words, we're at page 104. So we're through the easy part of the text, or at least for the first several pages, where it's just kind of history, and we're going to continue with that. So we were talking yesterday about the Ionan Codex Foundation original manuscript, which was 6th to 7th, and estimates go later as well. And so Dan, after working with that text, the Ionan, found that it wasn't the best source of understanding that higher level of law, or the actuality of law. Again, the word meaning how it works, as Yeshua taught it. And so in the first 13 chapters of Matthew, the only gospel recorded and promulgated in ancient Aramaic, and in which much of this higher law is found, has been lost and replaced with script on papyrus, estimated to be of the 13th century. And the point is made here that historically, anything other than Aramaic to that Semitic mind would have been blasphemous. I mean, if you know any Semitic peoples, can you imagine they develop this wonderful, amazing flower, and they turn to the Greeks and say, here, why don't you take it to the world? You know, we'll not do it in our language. I mean, it's just silly to say that it wasn't put in writing by the Aramaic minds that sourced that work. So with the sources at hand, and that was the Ionan Codex at that point, the foundation scholars had difficulty understanding many of the Aramaic word meanings that seemed to be intended for Yeshua's first century audience. Since the integrity of the project was founded on revealing what Yeshua actually meant in his teachings, and neither assumptions nor implications would be acceptable, they needed certain knowledge of a word meaning to be true to their commitment. So to help to resolve this, Dr. Ionan and Dan went to Persia, modern-day Iraq, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Syria. They traveled pretty extensively in the Middle East, and it was where Ionan had been born, so they were looking for deeper insight into those words, to the idioms, and especially the ones that, you know, the Western mind just didn't have a clue of. The Greeks certainly didn't comprehend. Their journey took them to an ancient Kurdish monastery atop one of the mountains in Kurdistan, the land of Gozan, near the river Habor, or Kabor in Aramaic, hence the name of the manuscript, the Khaboris manuscript. The language of this monastery was Aramaic, as it was spoken by Yeshua, and Ionan and Dan went there in around 1964, and they were spent several days with the abbot, who they said was over 100 years old and had to be carried everywhere on a pallet, that he wasn't very he wasn't able to mobilize under his own steam. And Ionan recalled or said at one point that he looked like a lump of dried clay from whence the smile and eyes of an angel blazed forth. That was Ionan's description of the abbot of this monastery. So in conversation, a number of critical insights came to their attention through this abbot. For especially, you know, they went with questions. What key words? You know, one of them was Rachma, and you know, as I've shared before, when we were in California, there's an Aramaic-speaking community there that we spent some time with, and we asked them about the word Rachma, and their input was that they had lost the meaning of it. They didn't know exactly what it meant, but that their tradition said that it was the most precious jewel that you could possess. And so the abbot explained some of those core words and much of the psychology of the Aramaic at the time, recognizing that, when they talk about the Beatitudes, they're talking about a literal construct or state of the mind that will support us functioning as human beings, and how these different states of mind affected the mind's function. In that meeting, they were shown the Khabouris, and after a lot of discussion, prayer, the monks consented to selling the Khabouris, and with a specific purpose of bringing truth to the West. So that was like their charge to Dan and Yonan in bringing that manuscript to the West. Tragically, the remaining contents of the library were seized soon afterwards, and Turkish authorities, basically stole what was there. And if you look up the Istanbul, and I've never looked online to see if this is something that is online at this point, but the Istanbul Gazette on June 11th, 1964, had pictures and the story of the documents that they still had there. And as I'd said earlier, or last week, I guess, that the suspicion was the monks were actually murdered, but nobody knows for sure what happened. So the Khabouris was scribed in the script of those early churches, but the manuscript was even older than the churches that were using it. The manuscript itself we've had dated twice at the University of Arizona. I think I know we've got a certificate of one of those in our files. And the imprimatur tells us that the words were copied from a 2nd century manuscript. And that manuscript, the original, which has since disappeared, was between 100 and 230 AD. The exactness and correctness of the copy is certified by an imprimatur of the Bishop of the Church of Nineveh, and that church would have been one of the largest in that area at that time, and that's one of the damaged pages of the Codex. So the Khabouris that we have now is a copy of that original text, and a complete text from that early Christian church. It's the whole complete New Testament according to the Eastern canon, and it brings Aramaic into the Western world more directly, especially when the scholars worked with getting the 1st century meanings of the words, to bring forward the meaning of the words as they would have fallen from Yeshua's lips 2,000 years ago. Goes on to explain that the complete history of the Khabouris is unknown. We know it was scribed in Nineveh approximately 1095 AD, and is an approved copy of that manuscript. They describe it in the colophon as 100 years after the Great Persecution, which would have been the Jewish revolt in 64 AD. So it would put the manuscript at about 164 AD. And it's on lamb's parchment. According to the Eastern canon, it's complete. It doesn't have revelations or some of the minor epistles, which were not accepted by the Eastern Church. The script of the Codex is Estranglio, which means to write the divine message. Estranglio script was specifically developed for Christian literature by the School of Edessa, which was located in what we now call Turkey. It was long thought to be a dead and unused language since the days of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. Really pretty crazy, these so-called religious wars, which of course had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with the darkness in men's mind who used their projection of their religious beliefs as the excuse to carry out the darkness of their own minds, which is, what all warring minds do. They'll find some reason, some justification. The versing used in the Aramaic New Testament is in conformity with the King James Version, and we're holding the space that these explanations, as we present them, will provide a deeper understanding and respect for and this is written by Dan, the truth, the most complete truth ever made known on earth, the teachings of Yeshua. And the acknowledgement is here that unfortunately we don't know what we don't know. So there are going to be inevitable errors, and for those, an apology is offered. The text of the Course delivers the words expressing these higher laws, and again, recognizing this is not the rule of a superior that we're talking about when we're talking about law. We're talking about an ability, and what we're hoping to do, what we're working to do with these two teachings with ourselves and with offering it to others, is to empower people to have direct contact with these eternal forces which emanate from what we could only call the unknowable creator in terms of direct knowledge. And that when we're prepared, we're going to have contact with this law, each of us individually, which is something the scriptures promise, that ultimately the teacher, the real teacher, is within each individual, and the mind has to be brought into harmony in order to cease interference with direct contact with these eternal forces. And so, there's a word in Aramaic, rucha, or rucha. It's actually one of those guttural type sounds that, if you really get really good at it, you kind of spit on people when you say it. And that word represents all of the eternal forces. So wind, air, fire, and water. Yeshua uses one of the other eternal forces when he's talking to one of the teachers from the temple. And Yeshua talks to him about Ruka de Kudsha. And in Aramaic, that phrase has been translated by the Greeks as the Holy Spirit, but in Aramaic it speaks of, and this is another one of those cases where, a hyphenated word in Aramaic turns into a whole paragraph in order to understand it. And so Yeshua has been talking to him about this specific elemental force, and it's feminine in nature. The language genders this term feminine, as in, if you're familiar with the Spanish language or the French language, there are words that are gendered feminine. La, L-A, and L-E determine how they're gendered. So this particular term was gendered feminine in Aramaic, and that best understanding I have of that is what that gendered feminine idea means is that it is not of the solidified energy field. It is not of what we would call the physical world. And those things that are masculine, gendered masculine in the language, are those things which are already in what we call the physical world, in that lower level of energy. And this is a good place to plug in one of the core concepts of this work from Albert Einstein, where he says, on such things as matter, we have been all wrong. What we have heretofore called matter is energy, energy whose vibrations have been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter. So Einstein's telling us matter doesn't exist. Our senses are attuned to a certain set of frequencies that we call material because our senses imply to us that they are material. It's a fraud. It's a fantasy. Clearly you can prove it to yourself very easily that there's no such thing as physical just by clapping your hands together. And notice that And many people would say, well, but wait a minute, that's proof that it is physical because one hand is solid and the other hand is solid, and when you clap them together, they inhibit each other's motion. Well, that's the first step in determining whether they're physical or not, or whether there's something solid there. The second step is, now let's imagine that we make your left hand out of radio waves. And now clap your hands together, and what happens? Well, obviously, the hand made out of radio waves passes right through the other hand. Proof that that other hand is clearly not solid. If it were solid, then the left hand made of radio waves would not pass through it. There's more space there, which physics is telling us, than there is anything that resembles matter, and what resembles matter is nothing but packets of energy. Now, if you take the thought experiment just one step further, and let's make both of your hands out of radio waves again. And notice that when you go to clap them together, they'd appear solid again. Not because there's anything solid about a radio wave, that's silly, but when the two are of the same, in the same atomic magnetic frequency range, create an interference pattern, and that's what makes things appear to be solid. And so when you recognize that we live in this energetic world, when the Aramaic genders the word feminine, it's speaking of an energy that is not in the realm that we would call physical. Gendered masculine would be something that is in the world that we would call matter. So with understanding this elemental force that was called Ruka Dikudsha, Ruka being the word that represents all of the eternal forces, earth, air, wind, fire, water, and that fifth element, Ruka. And the D would mean, similar to French, I guess, of, meaning of, an elemental force of, and Kudsha, the root of that word is kosher, which means that which is proper. So we're not speaking of a disembodied spirit being here, but we're speaking of a feminine elemental force that inclines us toward that which is proper for humans. Kosher would be the root of that. So this feminine elemental force is something that resides in all of us, as Yeshua taught it. And the extension of the definition of that would be this feminine elemental force. And there, in Aramaic, there are two functions that it has. One of them being an elemental force that has the power, when invited to do so, to undo the effects of our errors. I.e., if I ask that, if I've engaged in energy, remembering that everything is energy, and if you think about that word sin that we've talked about, that it is an archery term, and if you're on the archery range and firing at the bullseye and you miss the bullseye, the scorekeeper would yell sin, simply means you're off the mark. So if there is energy that I have taken into my structure that's off the mark for the integrated state of my so-called physical body-mind unit, my energy system, then I've introduced into my energy system, through ignorance or an act of will, an energy that does not belong in my energy system. And so Yeshua says that we each have in us this elemental force. Of course, will not violate our free will, but if we invite it to, will undo the effects of that, i.e., if it's, something in energy, remembering that the mind functions through every cell in the body, and mind energy is stored in every cell. If there is a particular organ that's been weakened or distorted or assaulted by the energy of sin, an energy that's off the mark, then there is an elemental force in us that will undo the effects of that. And if that energy, remembering that every energy that moves in us sets up an energy field, if that energy field that has been set up by that error energy has had an impact on someone, somewhere, or something in the world, we have this all-inclusive force that has the ability, again, if we're willing, if we're not holding on to that energy for a reason, that has the ability to undo it and all of its effects. So undoing the effects of errors, and to me this points back to the moment where Yeshua is in the Garden of Gethsemane and they talk about him taking on the sins of the world. He's not going to take anything from anybody that says, I need this, I'm going to hold on to this, I'm not letting go of this. He's not going to violate anybody's free will. But those who are stuck or lost in energy that they're willing to be finished with, in essence, he had the privilege of saying, oh, I'm willing to be the space of active love, to take those energetic patterns on, and in the presence of the hem of my garment, in the extension of the presence of my love, I'm willing to be the space that transmutes those energies and frees you of them. And so there's Ruku de Kudsha, that when we invite that feminine elemental force in us to go to work, undoes the effects of errors. And then the second major piece of that elemental force in us as humans is that it will teach us the truth. And in Aramaic, if we go back to that Ruku de Kudsha, in the creation story where that idea is first introduced, it's introduced, if you read the Greek texts, as the breath. It doesn't say, in Greek it says sent out its, God, the Creator sent out its spirit. In Aramaic it doesn't say that, it says breath. And when you take the time to still your mind and breathe, it's when, at least in my experience, you'll have the deepest contact with that feminine elemental force. And for me personally, as I said, and when I thanked Susan for her input yesterday, that's the time, early in the morning is the time when I step into that breath, and I find I get, oftentimes I think a little bit to Jeannie's chagrin, because she's wanting to sleep and I'm reaching for my phone, making notes for the download that I'm getting. So my apologies for that, honey. It's the time when that information comes. So this dual elemental force is unknown in the Western world, 2,000 years. And the Greeks have been talking about some kind of disembodied spirit being, and all the stories about it, with no knowledge of the direct implication that it is brought to you by your breath. And that's where the still point breathing becomes so important, because when we take breath away from something, when we remove our breath from an energy that we've taken into our field, that energy solidifies. You know, remembering that we are human energy systems, and every energy that we engage in is stored holographically in every cell, and where the breath is taken away, that's where that energy solidifies, becomes concretized, and ends up being passed from generation to generation to generation. What is in us that we need to, in our generational patterns, undo? I was talking to someone recently who was doing a lot of research into ancestry, and found out that two of their ancestors, a grandmother and a grandfather, back in the 1700s or so, had come over from England to Virginia and arrived in Virginia and had their first child here in Virginia at the age of 11. Think about what two children of 11, I mean, I've been contemplating this since I heard that conversation. What do you suppose two children at the age of 11. You know, I think about our granddaughter, Ari Rain, who's 5, and this would be something that would be happening to her in just 6 years. That 1, she'd be pregnant, and 2, she'd be taken from her home, put on a ship under who knows what conditions, and brought to Virginia. There's a national park and museum up in Northern Virginia that we visited a few years back, and one of the inscriptions on the wall of that, I can only imagine 11 that these 2 children must have been forced to come here as indentured servants. There are no parents. They didn't come with parents. And I can only imagine they must have come as indentured servants. And I know when we visited this kind of museum, national park display about the early settlers in Northern Virginia, there was one letter that was written by a tax collector who had come over from England to, you know, do some of the king's bidding, whatever that was. And part of the letter that he wrote was about the conditions of those who had come over as indentured servants. And what he wrote was that these people would have been better off dead than living as indentured servants in early America. I can't fathom. My mind can only imagine what 2 children of 11 with a girl that's pregnant, and a boy that's 11 that got her pregnant, are here having a baby in Virginia in 17, whatever it was, 25, 35, something in that range. What do you suppose became concretized? How much breath holding do you suppose 2 children of 11 in that state, and how much breath holding do you suppose happened with the child that was reared out of the minds and experience of these 2 children at 11 in a place where an adult of the day said these people would be better off dead than in this situation? What gets passed on in our genes, and are we willing to breathe deeply enough, fully enough to access whatever the thought disorders? I mean, we can only imagine, what the thought disorders would have been for 2 kids in that situation. At the age of, I think of myself at 11, fathering a child, living in mid-1700s America, and I can't imagine that 2 kids at 11 just went over and said, "Hey, I want a passage on a ship and I want to go to America." How much breath holding? How many atrocities? How much insanity? And of course, that's just one little tiny piece of history that doesn't even go into, the kinds of tragedies and travesties that happened in things like the Napoleonic Wars and the Mongols invading. And when we look at the crazy stuff that's gone down, what's come down in each of our genes? Yeshua was talking about this 2,000 years ago. I was talking about this with Jeannie yesterday, and one of the passages that comes to mind repeatedly for me when I think of what that culture was doing, and again, imagine what goes on in people's minds that they could possibly conceive of doing this behavior. But there's a passage that's laid out in the Old Testament where there's a young girl who's the son of a tribal Jewish chief, and one of the other tribes, I don't remember which one, and I'm sure the story tells what it is, but whichever it was not part of the Jewish community, and these two young people get together and they're playing footsie. And the young man, the young boy, professes his love for this girl and goes to the father of the girl and professes his love and says he wants to marry her. And the father, who's the head of this particular tribal group, says, yes, okay, but you're going to have to follow some rules. And the kid has the agreement, the young man has the agreement of his father, who's a tribal chief in this, whatever the other group was. And part of the negotiated settlement, in order not to kill the young man for violating his daughter, he requires, and the father agrees, that the people who are of that other group will join their Judaic tradition and religion and become Jews. And they move forward with the agreement and the idea that these two young people will marry, and all of the men of the tribe are circumcised. How good a fighter do you suppose a man is the day after he's been circumcised? And the father of the girl takes his warriors in and slaughters every relative of this young man, the women, the children, the men who've just been circumcised. What? Carrying in our genes. What? Individually and collectively. And I'm talking about all of us. You know, that's just one particular story, but you look at the stories and the history that we know of, what level of work, and this is so that's the audience that Yeshua was speaking to. That's the audience, you know, you go back to Moses, that's the audience Moses was speaking to. And you hear the mind that has not done its own shadow work, and it's a very common phrase yet today. So, well, even Moses said an eye for an eye, and that mind that has not done its own shadow work, has its own darkness, has not discovered itself as the active presence of love with the ability to function out of generosity and love, that mind takes it as a permission to do vengeance. When you go back with the mind that has done its own shadow work, a mind that is founded and functioning out of the energy that the human mind is designed to function off of, and that is love, that mind hears Moses say that, and that mind doesn't hear permission to take vengeance. Oh, okay, if somebody took out your eye, go take out their eye. If someone knocked out your tooth, go knock out their tooth. That's not what the mind of love hears. What the mind of love recognizes is, Moses was saying, you can't go kill their whole family, the whole community, for a simple offense, or even a terrible offense. You can't do it. Moses, when you look at that with the mind connected to love, is limiting the retribution and the violence available to them, that they couldn't do a disproportionate response to an offense. He wasn't commanding taking retribution. He was limiting retribution for those minds that had not done the work to return themselves to this state of love. So when we hear Yeshua say first order business, when you think of neighbor, and you know, when you listen to that story of the tribal chief and his daughter who's been violated, and the son who did the violation, and the father of that son, each of these people are neighbors. And in Aramaic, you got to understand that the word neighbor does not mean the guy down the block. It does not mean the guy next door or the guy on the other side of town. The word neighbor in Aramaic is a mental word, and in essence, basically saying, if you think of someone, then you're their neighbor, or they are your neighbor. And the first requirement of the law was you had to have this gateway open in your mind so that love was the presence in you that fueled your structure, that you were functioning as a human being. This is what Yeshua is attempting to bring to people. So this is, as the text is talking about here on page 20, this is the higher law, this is the highest law. Presented it 2,000 years ago, and that's what he presented, this understanding to those who stood around him. And basically, you know, and again, thank you, Susan, for your input yesterday, but I think about that passage that I repeat so often where a group of disciples are with Yeshua and they ask him what they need to do to please the Creator, and he tells them, and half of the audience says, too hard a saying, and they leave. And in essence, I think what we could understand is that when Yeshua gave them the answers to what to do, what he was saying was, you have to do your shadow work. You have to go in and deal with all of the generational patterns of hostility and fear in you to arrive at a place where the eternal forces from God are perceivable, detectable by your mind. Because if you have the interfering patterns of rage and guilt and grief and hatred and vengeance, and who knows what happened to two 11-year-old kids that were pregnant when they arrived in America in the 1700s. He's saying that it disables your mind and its ability to detect these eternal forces in which you live, move, and have your being, and you formulated a self, a false self, that functions out of those energies, and they inhibit your ability to have direct contact with these eternal forces. And basically, half of the disciples, if you go back and read that passage, said, too hard a saying. And if you read, even in the Greek translations of that particular passage, the statement, you know, the instruction he gives, you know, he uses an Aramaic idiom. He said, well, what do we need to do? And his answer is, you need to eat my body and drink my blood, which today we would understand to mean take communion. Obviously, it couldn't have been about taking communion 2,000 years ago, because half of the disciples said, too hard a saying, like, what's hard about a little wine and wafers? But half of his disciples said, too hard a saying, and they left. And as the discussion, if you go back and do some research on that passage, as the Greeks interpreted, the Greeks acknowledged that there are two different words that are used. There are two different parts of the conversation where this idea of eat my body and drink my blood is used. And in the first one, the first occurrence of it, it's a word is used, translated by the Greeks as a word that has to do with sitting down to a meal, like you're eating food. In the second occurrence of that in the conversation, the Greek word they use is more like an animal would gnaw at a bone. Implies that, and you know, you look at how many times we've looked at these passages over and over and over in different contexts, and I purposely bring them up in different contexts because in each case it gives an opportunity to clean up another part of the mind that holds these energetic patterns that inhibit our ability to be in touch with, in contact with the eternal forces, and helps us to build the brain cells to get, for the mind to be able to have a broader and broader and broader understanding that can support our being functioning as love. But the second occurrence in the Greek, if you look at the finer Greek ideas there, it speaks about gnawing on these teachings. And that's what we've been doing for the last 12 years. That's what I've been doing for the last, since I started working with the American 43, 4, 5 years ago. It's gnawing on it. It's gnawing on it because there are so many energetic patterns. I mean, they're just, If you imagine a bird's wings, this is how I was shown it at one point. If you imagine a bird's wings and every feather moving in a direction to produce a result, that an understanding would be as complex as the largest set of birds' wings moving in unison to produce an energetic motion toward. And as language developed, it moved people toward whatever the mind energy was of the people developing the language. And if the energetic patterns under the development of the language was hostility, fear, violence, viciousness, and war, then the energies that would move in one as a result of the use of those words of that language would create this, imagine a set of giant eagle's wings, or let's think about an albatross. The stroke of those wings would move one, those energetic patterns, every feather moving in a direction would produce an impetus in a certain direction. And why do we have to gnaw on the teaching? Why do you have to take it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper within you? Because each feather moving that albatross's wing set would represent an energetic inclination toward a certain behavior. And if your inclination toward a certain behavior is based in hostility or fear, it's not just one little thought moving it, but each thought that moves people toward violence, toward hostility or fear, would be like the stroke of every feather in the albatross's widespread wings. And that, each stroke that contributes to that, ultimately needs to be forgiven. That's the depth of the forgiveness work. And then to build into the mind energetic patterns that are in harmony, as you gnaw on the eternal forces, in harmony with those eternal forces, then you build a strength, a power, like those eagle's wings or that albatross's wing, to move you toward being in harmony, being in sensibility, in a sensibility type of contact, being sensitive to those eternal forces that are always around us, that are always moving and always available, but move nothing else if there's no resonance for it. If the resonance is out of the hostilities and fears and the breath holding of 1,000 generations, then those things can be presented to us, but there's nothing to move in us to produce that motion toward. As you build the brain cells, as you interact, we've been doing this conversation for 12 years, and, take any given example that I use. I've used several of them today, and I've used them 1,000 times, and each time it's like building that wing structure, building that energetic structure toward that which will lift you into the ability to actually be in direct contact with and function out of these eternal forces. And those who refuse to do, have not done their shadow work, will not engage in the forgiveness process, would be the situation where Yeshua talked about the house divided against itself. Can't stand. And in essence, what my take would be of that idiom that he used, eat my body and drink my blood, that these disciples so rejected that they left. They said, too hard a saying. They're saying you have to work with every bit of energy in your bloodline, in your genes, in your structure that moves against these eternal forces that are based in love. You've got to confront them. You've got to work through them. You've got to forgive them. That is, remove them from your structure. And you have the assistance of this singular elemental force that is there only at your will. It's not going to interfere because we were handed that free will. And if the forces for violence, for war, for hatred, for abuse, for pain, for depression, for negativity are born and bred in you, this is not a work that's done in a day or two or a year or two or 5 or 10. Because every influence in all of our generations move us in one direction or another. And those who said too hard a saying said, I just can't do that level of work. I'm leaving, and they left and they never came back. Here's hoping that you're with us to stay and to do this work that is so necessary to return to us as human beings, the tender beings that we are, made of the active presence of love, bringing healing to each of those generational assaults, each of those energetic patterns that moves us in a negative direction, each feather that unfolds in one direction or another, and those that move toward any form of hostility or fear being plucked out, forgiven, removed. It is a hard saying, no question. And we're here to support it being done. So appreciation for you joining us. We hold the space for you to do the deepest, most powerful, and profound work in your life, of your life, and create the best year yet.